Hello, my name is Faye Johnstone. I use she and they pronouns, and I am a trans educator and organizer based on unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory, known these days more often as Ottawa. I'm really honored to be sending this video to y'all, and I hope that it is useful to you. But anyways, I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking a little bit about the work that I do, about what I'm involved in, and then I'm going to dive a little bit more into a conversation around delivering gender-affirming or trans-affirming care. So in terms of who I am, as I said, I'm Ottawa-based. I do a lot of different things, so I always find it hard to answer the question of what does Faye do? I work as a gender, sex, and sexuality educator, both with community organizations and nonprofits, as well as with schools and young folks, to basically talk to them about diverse identities, talk to them about things like sex education, and really help build the capacity of our schools, our agencies, and our service providers themselves to deliver trans-affirming and gender-affirming care. Outside of that, I'm a creative facilitator, so I spend a lot of time in front of groups of people and, telling them to do things and hoping that the things I'm telling them to do are effective and kind of have value and let them leave spaces and take new knowledge from those spaces. I'm an organizer, so I also spend a lot of my time getting angry at folks, specifically around trans issues. So you might not know this, but we passed a trans rights bill in Canada a year and a bit ago, and so I was involved with that. I've been really involved with some of the push to defend sex ed lately, as we've seen our provincial government make some changes to that. That has had a very significant and will continue to have a significant impact on trans kids. And then lately I'm spending a lot of time writing things, which is an interesting thing that I never thought I would be doing, but I keep writing things and people seem to like publishing them, and so that's been a good time. But essentially, at the end of the day, I'm an organizer, an educator, and an advocate, and so I do whatever comes across my desk, and I spend as much time as I can organizing and advocating and educating in the best interests of LGBTQ2S+, but particularly trans kids. So that's enough about me. I'm going to spend the next couple minutes or a few minutes chatting a bit more broadly about gender-affirming care. But I'm going to start by talking about gender, because it's hard to talk about gender-affirming care if we don't talk about what gender is. So gender is complicated. We all have our own relationship to what gender is. There's 100 different models and understandings of gender. But the way that I think and talk about gender, and that I think is the most important way to think and talk about gender as service providers, and when we're talking about systems of gender, is that gender is both socially constructed and deeply personal. So what that means is that our understanding of gender actually isn't fixed. It is not something that is a thing that you can reach out and touch, and so it changes. Our understanding of what it means to be a man or a woman or a non-binary person now is very different from what it meant 100 years ago. And we also know that different communities and cultures and spaces around the world have had different understandings of gender from the one that we have in place here in the West at this moment. And so gender changes. But sometimes folks think that, okay, gender is socially constructed, so why should we care? But gender is also deeply personal. We live in a society that is guided very fundamentally by gender. Gender is a thing that we all have a strong, intimate relationship with. And sometimes we don't. Sometimes our relationship to gender is that we think it's stupid and it should go away. But at the end of the day, a lot of us really do have strong feelings around our gender. And our gender, because of the world that we live in, because patriarchy is a thing, transphobia is a thing, toxic masculinity is a thing, gender is a very significant influence on our health, our well-being, and the ways in which we experience the world. And so gender is both constructed socially, but also deeply meaningful and important and personal to people. When I talk about gender identity, I talk about it as an internal sense of self, a sense of who you are, what your gender is deep down. A lot of folks who are cisgender, which is a term that we use to describe somebody whose gender assigned at birth is the gender with which they identify. So, you're born, the doctor's oh, this person has these bits, and so I'm going to, call this person a dude, and then we're going to put all of these labels on that person forevermore. But essentially, a cisgender person is somebody whose assigned gender is the gender with which they identify. And so a lot of cisgender folks think that, gender is a thing that, trans people talk about, and is, relevant to them. But gender, again, is a thing that all of us have a relationship to, and a lot of us, or most of us, do have a gender identity. It might not be something that we had to think about, but if you're a woman in this world, you probably did have to, because sexism is a thing, and we treat women differently than we do men. And so gender also is not a fixed, stable experience, both like on a social side, but also on a personal side. People's understanding and relationship to their own gender can change and is fluid and evolving. I didn't always identify in the way that I do now. I am open to the idea that in a few years, God, I might use a different label to describe myself, and that's a thing that is cool with me. Gender is complicated and it changes. In terms of some key terms for y'all, I don't tend to try to get bogged down in, like telling you the right way to talk about the right thing, because that isn't actually super important a lot of the time. Like there's some tips and tricks that I'll get into that I think are important for you to keep in mind, but at the end of the day, like people, as like a gender-affirming approach, and the approach that we already use in our social services and that are embedded in child and youth care, in social work, in all of the programs that train like folks who do work with other folks in social service sectors, is about centering the client and centering like person-centered care. And what that means is that we're basically letting the person lead the way. We're listening to their experiences, we're supporting them based off of the needs that they identify, and we're realizing that our role as caretakers and service providers isn't to be a dictator, isn't to be telling people what's best for their health, but to really help them identify what's best for their health and give them the resources and the support that they need to be as well as they can be, and to be, like succeeding, to be meeting their most basic needs. And so all of this whole conversation around gender-affirming care, I want it to be framed within that understanding that core values of the work that we do already includes gender-affirming care. And so when I work with service providers, they again think I can give them this roadmap around like, you know the right words, the right tips, the tricks, the lingo, and you'll be perfect. But that's not actually what gender-affirming care is about, because people are different and diverse. People have different needs. People have different understandings of their identities. And so at the end of the day, gender-affirming care is really about honoring that. It's about giving space to that and allowing people to articulate their own lived experiences and then frame our own approach and our care from there. But anyways, I am still going to give you some tips, tricks, and terms. So I said the word cisgender a little while ago, and I think I explained that one. Trans is another term that a lot of folks hear these days. Trans is an umbrella term that describes somebody whose gender assigned at birth is different from the gender with which they identify. So that includes like non-binary folks, that includes all sorts of folks with like gender queer, agender, gender diverse. Like it's a very broad umbrella term that some folks also don't really love and don't identify with, but at its broadest it captures anybody whose gender identity is different from the one they were assigned at birth. In terms of some other like concrete things to keep in mind, I'm going to go through a few of my like top tips. The first one is around respecting names and pronouns. If you don't know what a pronoun is, we use them all the time. She, her, he, him, they, them, these are all pronouns. And pronouns are essentially an essential way and an important way of identifying each other, right? Like when I meet somebody, I try to find out what their pronoun is because I don't want to be calling somebody by a name or a pronoun that they don't actually like or use or have any relationship to, or which they find harmful towards them, right? And so one of the biggest things that I tell service providers about is that we need to normalize the idea that you can't assume somebody's identity based off your perception of them. And so what that means is that if somebody walks in the room and has like a real nice nail polish like I do, great lipstick, is like looking all feminine and all of those things, that doesn't actually necessarily mean that that person is a woman. Because somebody has breasts doesn't mean they're a woman. Because somebody has a penis doesn't mean that they're not. And so one of the biggest things that I tell folks is like take all of those presumptions that are embedded in our society, that are taught to us by patriarchy and by transphobia, and like unpack those. And I say that both because it's the best way to meet the needs of our clients, but also because it's a really important process for all of us to go through, to really start thinking through the ways in which our worldview and the assumptions that we make about this world are things that are taught to us, as opposed to things that are actually true. And so that's a common thing that I try to encourage service providers to do, is to engage in that critical self-reflection around their own perception and relationship with these systems of gender and sexism and other systems like racism and colonialism and ableism and classism and all of the other isms that exist in our world. As you unpack it, you realize more and more that A, these systems are connected to each other, but also that so many of the ideas that we have, the ways in which our society functions, are actually directly because of these systems of oppression, and that actually has a harmful impact on folks in their everyday lives. So I feel like I got a little bit off topic there. I have been working all day, and I just got back from Toronto and a conference, and my train was late, so sorry if I'm a little bit all over the place. But essentially, pronouns are an important thing. Pronouns come in all shapes and sizes. There's they, there's she, there's her, there's ze, there's zer. There's a whole bunch of them. And the thing with pronouns is that it's important you don't assume somebody's pronouns based off their presentation. You also should provide opportunities for folks to disclose their pronouns to you. So, you don't know somebody's pronouns, and it can be scary for somebody who's trans and gender diverse, particularly if they're a child or a young person, to assert those things if they're not invited to. And so provide opportunities that don't scare people and aren't forcing them to do so, but that let them know that it's totally cool if they disclose that to you, and that you'll support them and be there for them if they do. Another thing is around names. Again, people use different names than they might have on their legal documents. My legal name is different from the one that I introduced myself with today. And so I think just in terms of names, I'll say be intentional when you're working in child and youth services, that you don't that you provide opportunities for folks to disclose their legal name, or their chosen name, not their legal name, and that you really affirm and are intentional about when you actually might need access to their legal name, but that you also keep that private and confidential, because it's nobody's business, and it's just a piece of paper that our parents arbitrarily decided to write this name on, and it's not always the name that best reflects the person that we are, the way that we navigate the world. Another thing about a gender-affirming approach that I like to talk about, and that I find service providers are very confused by, is there's this idea in our society now that if you make a mistake, the world's going to end. It's an idea that I think is traced to a conservative backlash around the idea of safer spaces and this idea of political correctness. I don't think that political correctness is a thing. I think that we're actually just learning to be more decent humans. But what that culture has led to, and that backlash has led to, is that people are afraid to screw up. And so my thing that I tell folks is that yes, you will make mistakes. No, that actually doesn't make you a bad person. Yes, it is still painful and it hurts us, and we might respond with that in mind. If you misgender me, or if you use my legal name when I don't use that, if you call me a man, good God, I'm going to be annoyed. My response will range. Sometimes if it's happened 10 times that day, I'll be more than a little bit annoyed. But if it happens once, just apologize and move on. And so no, it's not an inappropriate response for us to be a little bit emotional when you use the wrong pronoun or use the wrong name, because it is actually at the end of the day a denial of our very existence. And when trans people use different names and pronouns, we have to assert those every day, and the world around us is constantly ignoring and erasing that fact, which is a real hard time, and it's stressful, and it's difficult, and we don't live in a world that is super great for trans folks. So our emotional responses are valid, and so have empathy if somebody is responding to you with more emotion if you make a mistake than you would expect them to. Yes, we actually do want you to move on. If you make a mistake, please God, don't spend 30 minutes talking about it. It makes us uncomfortable. It means that everyone else in the room is hearing you loudly talking about how you used the wrong pronoun, and now everyone else in the room knows that I'm trans, and I don't always want that. No, it's actually not about you in these contexts. When you misgender somebody, when you dead name somebody, the real thing going on there is that person has been hurt. That was a microaggression, a small, arguably, act of violence in a continuum of violence, but a thing that is still an act of violence. And when you cause somebody harm, the appropriate thing to do isn't to center your own experience and spend a few minutes talking about how sorry you are. It's about moving on and doing better. In terms of some other things, so at the end of the day, I could talk for ages on end around what trans and gender diverse folks need, what children and young folks need, but the thing that I want to leave you with more than anything else is that harsh reality is that this world often isn't great to trans and gender diverse kids. Or to trans and gender diverse folks generally. I've been spending a lot of time talking these days about how like the very act of being safe in public is a thing that is denied to a lot of trans people. It is a really scary thing to live in a world as well where like your identity is being debated in the media, where a lot of the time your parents might not support you. And unfortunately, a lot of trans folks don't have good experiences accessing the social services that folks like yourselves and folks like me work in or work for. And so take that and bring some compassion into your work. Realize that you actually have an opportunity when you're working with trans and gender diverse young people to shift that experience, to really model what good care looks like. And a lot of these kids haven't had that opportunity. But more than anything else, and as I have said before, gender affirming care is about centering the needs of the person. It is about listening to what they're saying. It is about supporting them and identifying ways to meet those needs. Gender affirming care is already a thing that we should be doing. It is a thing that is embedded in all of the codes of ethics and all of the best practices around working with children and youth and being professionals in these spaces. And so it's not actually as scary as you think it is. It's not as difficult and abstract as we often think about it being. Listen to the folks that you're serving. Ask them what pronouns they use. Ask what language they use, have those conversations with them. Don't expect them to educate you and do that work yourself. But at the end of the day, if you're listening to the person you're working with and if you're doing a little bit of that legwork on your own time, you're going to do great. You can make that happen. And that can actually be a distinct, better experience for that kid than that kid might have had ever before accessing services in a child and youth serving agency. So again, this has been a pleasure to speak with you folks. I hope this was useful to you. I also apologize for the fact that I'm a little bit delirious right now. It's been a long day, but I hope that you folks have a wonderful class, and Julie can pass along my email if folks have any questions or want to get in touch, and I'm super happy to also send resources or anything like that, but I also know that Julie has you folks well in hand. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful day.